I'm Matt.
I'm Kerry.
We are the Stagmer brothers of Baltimore Knife and Sword. We're going to be building some of your favorite weapons, and some weapons that you've never seen before.
This is Man-at-Arms, REFORGED. In Dark Souls lore, Sir Knight Artorias was one of the 4 Knights of Gwyn who battled the Dark Wraiths. His greatsword was born from the soul of the great grey wolf Sif, and according to lore, it strikes harder against dark servants. The Man-at-Arms team is super excited to build this weapon because the sword is incredible, humongous, ornate, intricate, with tons of detail, and beautiful. We're building the weapon now because the newest iteration of the game, Dark Souls 3, drops Tuesday, April 12th.
At this point, I'm sure you guys are starting to realize why we turned this build down in previous seasons. The sheer size of it and the ton of detail that goes into this piece is going to make it a really long project. It's going to be a brutal forging and a whole lot of grinding. Ilya is going to start this off by moving the Nasal power hammer and start breaking down this huge bar, turn it into a flat bar, and then he's going to start adding in some detail. Now that we have a large portion of this metal broken down into a bar, Ilya has a much better sense of the amount of metal he's going to need.
1, 2, 3.
So he cuts off the excess, goes back to the forge, and starts forging on the end again. At this stage, you can see Ilya's got the blade drawn out a lot further, but there's still a long way to go. He's going to work on the flat and on the sides and continue to draw that out until we have a lot more of that blade shape we're looking for and a defined tip.
So from the multiple images that we found for the Greatsword of Artorias, we actually have discovered that in some of the pictures we find the pieces are round, in some pictures we find that they're hexagonal. What we've decided based on how we're doing the engravings is that the very top fitting will actually be a round section on the pommel. The lower part of the pommel, which we're going to be engraving, is hexagonal. Those will actually become tapered off on an angle before we do the engraving. And then this is the lower part of the handle that sits on top of the guard. I've actually taken a very large piece of 4140 and cut it hexagonal. I'll cut this last piece and get it all even. And then this also gets engraved all the way around. We'll be doing that on the CNC mill. There's 3 separate patterns that have to be engraved into this hexagonal part. Then they're duplicated on the opposite side. I'll be using the CNC milling machine to cut these in.
The last forging we have to do on the power hammer is to pull out those ears near the shoulder. He's just going to work real carefully on the side using the side of the dies to make those more defined. Now that that's done, he moves to the anvil and begins doing some hand beveling right around that area just to create a little more width and save me a little time in the grind.
So this will be the Greatsword of Artorias. In one of our previous episodes, Matt said if we can forge it, he can grind it. Well, I made his job a little bit easier by starting a little bit of a bevel right here. The next thing is for him to grind it to shape.
Alright, got our blade back from forging. Looks pretty good. I only have to do a little bit of profile grinding on this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start here at the ears, get those trued up, then I'm going to move to the point. I'm a little guy, so grinding these big blades is a huge challenge. This sword is definitely going to put my skills to the test. grinding the edges on this blade, I'm going to start by hogging off a lot of material horizontally. I'm not going to leave it as a hollow grind, but I'm going to start off that way. John's going to help me by holding the end of the blade as I hollow grind it, and then I'll move on to going up and down and turning that into a flat grind.
Matt now begins the arduous task of vertical grinding this sword. This will give us our final form for the edges.
I set up my little embossing tool here. It only sets up my lines. Then I have to go in and refine the lines with a series of armoring hammers. The Greatsword of Artorias is certainly a beautiful piece of design. It's an intricate piece with a lot of subtle variations and details. The sword is grotesque and beautiful at the same time. The affection with the grotesque, our fascination with it, dates back to the ancient Greeks with the mythology of chimeras and monsters, gods coming out of each other's heads and slaughtering each other. That fascination brings about the rest of the Western tradition all the way up to the 19th century, and we produce myths of the modern age like Dracula, Frankenstein. We again are fascinated with the sublime moment when the human existence is so minuscule in front of the terrible, in facing our mortality. And hereabout comes the video game tradition of designing horrible situations where only a demigod can win the day. The Greatsword of Artorias is one of the few pieces of game design that really embodies that tradition from the ancient Greeks through the 19th century and to the modern digital age.
Going back and forth between a heat source and some oil, Ilya blackens down the center sections for this sword. He now goes to the Scotch-Brite to create highlights on these pieces.
So I've prepared the section for the lower part of the handle where it meets the guard. I've got to cut a few more beauty rings into it. You can see I've got some pieces marked here. It also has to be bored so that we can put a large section of the tang through it. I now have the pommel section already set up so that the ornamented discs fit on it. Now I've got to take it and make the spike or bullet form, and I'm going to use the automatic feed on the lathe to make that smooth and much finer. Using the CNC plasma, John cuts the wing sections of the guard. These will be preforms that Ilya will forge and sculpt to shape. Using the fly press more like a clamp, Ilya takes the pipe that will become the guard ends, brings it up to temperature, and then bends it to match a previous piece that he checked for curvature. The pieces of this guard aren't round, they're actually somewhat oval, so Ilya begins to drive it down to match that form. Ilya now takes a hand grinder and cuts the form into the tubes that he curved earlier in the forge. Ilya takes these 1/4-inch steel semicircles and rolls them into a cone. This will attach the guard ends to the center section. He's not exactly sure how long they're going to be, so after he rolls them, we'll cut them to shape. Now that we have the form on these flared guard sockets, Matt cuts the overlaps so that we can weld them together. Now that these sockets have been welded together, Ilya is going to squish them down so that they make that transition right from the round section of the guards into the main center section as it's mounted to the blade.
So I finished carving the guard parts, and right now what's left is to weld them together. The top is going to go into this socket right here, and John will weld it on the inside. After that, Matt is going to Scotch-Brite it and prepare the pieces of wood that go inside, completing the guard.
I'm gonna start by using a big piece of rectangular wood. All right, now it fits pretty good. You can see though right here, I gotta change my angle just slightly so it sits flush and my two pieces meet underneath our collar here. Kinda like that. All right, now we got our wood fitted. It's just roughed in though. Still gotta go in on the narrow wheel and add a little bit of detail on the centerpiece here. Cut them off, and then we'll get everything welded together. The central ridge of the blade has two overlays on either side, one towards the center and one down towards the tip. Ilya is going to use the Dremel, just like he did on the guard parts, and carve that detail in.
I've set up some of my long lines with the narrow wheel on the grinder. That saves me quite a bit more time with the Dremel tool. Now I'm going to go back in and start with the carbide cutter, turning this into this.
Using a sander, Ilya now blends the welds off on these winged overlays.
In the final stages of polishing out the edge bevel in order to get a nice crisp clean straight line, which is impossible by hand with an angle grinder. I've clamped a sacrificial straight edge to the blade, and then I'm going to grind right up to it with an angle grinder. All right, let's take the clamps off and see how it turned out. We have a nice, clean, crisp edge. The next step is to deck the top and then polish it out with Scotch-Brite discs.
All right, the last few steps that I'm in charge of on this build before we can start assembly is getting our horn parts all blackened. I've gone ahead and painted the wood parts black. Now I gotta get the outside steel shells completely darkened. Then I'll insert the wood, epoxy them together, and we can start welding it all up. This one's already been blackened. I'll go ahead and heat this up in the forge, dip it in oil, and heat blue this one as well. We went ahead and masked off the edge of the blade. The whole edge needs to stay nice and bright. The center is gonna get really dark, so we're gonna use some black oxidizer, Scotch-Brite pad to apply it. Just keep scrubbing that center until we get our desired darkness. Then we'll clean it, take the tape off the edge, and everything should be good to go. First it turns kind of copper color, then it turns green, then it gets into the black. Gonna scrub the overlays as well. We'll then highlight the surface, leaving the background nice and dark.
Matt pulls back the masking tape to reveal the crisp edge where the black and silver meet.
So the handle for Dark Souls in this case is not very long and doesn't have a lot of leather. There's a lot of other metal parts that are fitted to this. We've already blackened the background on this piece and then repolished the foreground using a Scotch-Brite wheel. Now we're going to adhere the leather. It's going to go in here, wrap over itself. We're going to glue it in place. It's going to have some epoxy at the very end to make sure everything stays permanently, and then we'll lock it down with that big pommel.
Now Now that we have our overlays welded to our main plate, it's time to get our horns fitted. You can see I went ahead and notched away some material here so everything fits just right. Now I gotta go and repeat it on this side. All our hard work has finally come down to this. It's time to start construction. Now that everything's fit properly, John can now begin welding the horns onto the base of the guard. We can finally get our first glimpse of this massive sword. Just gotta do a few touch-ups here and there, and we'll be ready for the demos.
The Greatsword of Artorias really pushed us yet again. It allowed us to make some decisions on how we would do certain things in these builds that I'm sure is going to allow us to do more elaborate pieces in the future.
Click here to subscribe, or click here to watch more episodes. Thanks for watching Man-at-Arms Reforged. We need to know what you want the guys to build, so tell us in the comments below what weapons you want to see next.